of Mura hadn't realized it actually softened Jared's fall. On the other hand, when Jared cast the ice storm earlier, it sped up Aeon's fall, causing him to plummet faster. Jared revealed that he had purposely let himself be hit to ensure Aeon fell into the dimensional portal where Jared had already set up his trap. In the end, Jared remarked all of Aeon's mocking words about Creo were for nothing, and now he was on the brink of death. Jared also pointed out that Horo subordinate had been in his grasp from the very beginning. Irritated, Jared declared that Akon had committed numerous crimes and would now receive the justice he deserved. The blonde boy unleashed a massive fire spell and hurled it at his enemy, incinerating Aeon completely. As A's body turned to ash, Jared received several rewards for completing his mission. He foe in himself that A never stood a chance, even at the mage hadn't even managed to tear his clothes. Elsewhere, the bloody war between the armies of Kriba and Renalone amid the chaos. A little farther back, Hayes was diligently using her healing magic to help the wounded soldiers. As the battle progressed, Batman noticed that Kia's defenses were starting to crumble. Lax continued cutting down enemy soldiers, urging his men to hold the line. However, one of his comrades reported that they needed reinforcements at the center, as the soldiers' formation had broken. With that breach, Rel soldiers began piercing through Crib's defenses. Batman then ordered his soldiers to ignore the common soldiers and target the civilians in the lower areas. One of Batman's subordinates, with a greedy grin, thought to himself that he would be filthy rich by the time this war was over. Hayes and the others assisting the wounded noticed the approaching enemies and were struck with fear. Without hesitation, one of Batman's soldiers charged at the defenseless civilians, but just before he could strike, a metal ball brutally smashed into his face. Batman's comrades were in shock as they realized what was standing before them. An ex-veteran soldier of Kia stepped forward, remarking that despite LACC's earlier comments about Kia's weakening power, they couldn't have expected to be pushed back so easily. A woman wielding a massive iron mace added that since they had left, Kia's army had grown weak. Another man wearing a woken cloak speculated that this weakness was why Jared had sought them out even after their retirement. Let Kid, seeing his old comrades, asked why they had taken so long. The man responded that they had dealt with the remaining Mala warriors before arriving. Several soldiers, accompanied by Kia's veterans, took their positions for battle. The old veteran began rousing speech declaring that they were there in the name of Barrett, Kia's great leader and Jared Barrett's successor and the current lord. He ended by proclaiming that the 100 elite soldiers of Barrett's army and the 900 soldiers of Jared's would now fight together as allies in this war. In a flashback, we see Iber Jared speaking to Orson, telling him that he had done well until then. The chubby boy said that Orson had served Kriba for a long time, but it was now time for his retirement. Orson tried to protest, stating that he had been part of the royal guard of the territory serving under Barrett, but Jared coldly replied that his father was dead. Jared also said that just like Tall, the soldiers who had served his father were no longer needed. The narrator explained that Jared had suddenly dismissed most of the soldiers, and the reason was Kia's lack of funds. More specifically, it was because the young lord was spending money on his personal desires to live a luxurious life. Quietly corrupt individuals had taken advantage of the situation and seized control of Kriba. All the guards who had been associated with Barrett were forced out of their positions, and soldiers who had received high wages faced continuous pay cuts. Orson and the veterans like him could not stand by and watch the nation they had worked so hard to build slowly collapse. Instead, they pledged to live out their days in silence, retreating to the forest to disappear quietly. On a snowy day, Orson, dressed in his coat, was out hunting. The man noticed that the snow was particularly heavy that day, and at this rate he might have to give up on his hunt. In the distance he saw a tribe of goblins approaching, carrying iron minerals. Orson prepared for battle, wondering how those monsters had made it so deep into the forest. The goblins, noticing the misunderstanding, tried to show that they meant no harm. The creature simply ignored the veteran and continued on their way, watching them leave, or couldn't understand why the goblins had disregarded him. Later he went to a blacksmith and questioned him about the situation. The dwarf explained that the goblins were likely delivering the iron they had ordered, as they had been selling tons of weapons to the military recently. Excited, the blacksmith added that thanks to orders from the lord they had been working 24 hours a day, and Orson remarked that it sounded exhausting. The dwarf agreed, but said that thanks to this all the blacksmiths were now living as they had always dreamed. Thanks to Jared, the blacksmith had been reignited with a passion for his craft. He then asked Forsen to keep it a secret, as the weapons they were crafting were being delivered in secrecy. Orson reflected that at first he thought the changes happening in Kia were just luck. However, more and more changes occurred in the territory, leading to its development and the resolution of various problems. As a result, soldiers who had once abandoned Creo recognized these changes and returned to the army, giving Jared a second chance for everything he had done. These men supported Jared and helped overcome the enemy invasion because they were the best of the best. The armies of Mura and Ranella simply didn't stand a chance against Kia, as the veterans had the EXP experience and skill to prevail. After the bloody battle that resulted in Rel's defeat, Orson commented that those men were useless at that moment. Several warriors had completely surrendered and the remaining ones decided to retreat, knowing they couldn't defeat that army. As he fled on horseback, Batman thought to himself that Horos was an idiot, unable to foresee that the enemies would be hiding. Desperate, he regretted forming an alliance with his greatest enemy and decided to withdraw before Jared arrived. Back at the hidden path, Horos was leading the remainder of his soldiers. They noticed an enemy approaching from above and realized it was a mage. Immediately the leader of Mura recognized the opponent. It was Jared. Before Horos could react, Jared appeared beside him and asked with a sly smile if Horos was doing well. Panicking, the Lord of Mura tried to strike at Jared, but Horo, trying to recover, was severely weakened and covered in burns. As Jared descended slowly, he remarked that he had known from the beginning that peace was impossible, as Koros had been silently planning this war all along. The boy quickly charged at the bald man, striking him in the face and shattering his helmet. Jared continued to pump the weak ward and then declared that Horos had planned to take everything from Kriba. For that reason, Jared decided to end it then and there, ensuring that his subordinates would no longer suffer at the hands of Mura. Jared, standing over the defeated Horos, declared that he would cleanse his territory completely. He unleashed a series of magical attacks against his enemy. The battered and broken Horos scoffed, asking Jared if he really thought this would change anything. In response, Jared calmly stated that he knew he would make mistakes, but there was one thing he was sure of. Looking down at his kneeling enemy, Jared declared that even the old version of himself was better than Horos and Ra. The bald man tried to retaliate, but Jared swiftly pierced Koros' leg with a knife, mocking him, saying he would relieve the stress for him. Despite his injuries, Koros held on to his pride and questioned whether Jared truly thought his death would solve everything. The defeated lord warned that once the Imperial Knight General found out, he would bring his knights to seek vengeance. Suddenly Jared pulled out his Paradiso diary and asked Horos if he knew what it was. Flipping through the pages, Jared calmly informed Koros that if he was talking about BYX, he wouldn't be coming to avenge him. Shocked, Horos demanded to know how Jared knew that name. Jared explained that the diary contained countless nights of meticulous writing detailing people and events in this world, just a collection of personal notes. With a smile, Jared revealed that he had remembered Horos and Barrow were related. He laughed eerily, asking if Horos really thought that Barrow, the Imperial KN General of Adama, would travel over 5,000 kilometers, crossing 4 kingdoms and dozens of territories for a feudal cause like this. Jared emphasized that while Bro might not take Horo death lightly, for someone as power-hungry him, Horos was a disgrace rather than a valuable family member. In fact, Jared continued, no one would mourn the death of the leader of Mura. Instead, they'd likely be relieved that the troublemaker was gone. With a GLE smile, Jared told Horos that his life had been utterly worthless. Finally, Jared remarked that he had prepared far more than Horos could have imagined, so he need to worry. As he said this, a magic circle began to form beneath Horos. With a small gesture of mercy, Jared asked if Horos had any final words. Infuriated by this final insult and with his pride shattered, Horos pulled the knife from his leg and lunged at Jared, cursing him. In an instant, a wave of blue magic surged toward the leader of Mura. In the blink of an eye, Horos was frozen solid like a statue. To finish the war, Jared remarked that Horos was in a bad mood and said he hear the rest of his final words. In another life, the frozen Horos began to crumble into dust and was carried away by the wind. With the battle complete, Jared gained several status points. Relieved that it was all over, he collapsed to the ground. Looking at the remaining soldiers of Mura, they lock eyes with Jared, realizing there was no point in resist, and they all immediately surrendered, raising their hands in defeat. The narrator explained that the remaining soldiers of Mura stripped off their armor and surrendered, making in an easy victory. Cherry didn't celebrate the win, but instead advanced with a new strategy, disguising himself as a citizen of Mura. From the beginning, Sherdan had only one goal: to bring Mura and Ranella under his control. In the end, Mura fell to the Caribbean Empire. In just one day, the ruler of that territory had changed hands. Afterward, Jared reflected on how Kia had become self-sufficient even though it was still weak. Suddenly Lacus appeared, asking what their next move would be. Lacus pointed out that, like Kia, Rella lacked his stronghold, and with its military force destroyed, it was highly unlikely he would be able to defend themselves now. Jared agreed, noting that in warfare the side with the superior numbers usually won confidently. Jared told his soldiers that they would now march on Rella. However, Jared's ambitious plan was disrupted by the arrival of an unexpected individual. We now see Jared sitting in a meeting room with Batman. A man named Caper was explaining that as the leader responsible for the war, Lord Koros had died, with that the cause of the conflict had been eliminated and good results have been produced. Jared disagreed, saying that he didn't believe the responsibility lay with just one person. At that moment, Batman, visibly nervous, called out Caper's name, fearing what could happen to his own territory. The red-haired Caper then stated that if this was the case, Lord Batman should agree to pay a compensation fee, adding that as a pacifist he didn't want to see his neighbors involved in another war. Observing the unfamiliar figure, Jared quickly realized that Caper was likely plotting to take advantage of Rel's vulnerability. He suspected the man was putting on a performance, pretending to be a pacifist while waiting for the chance to stab Batman in the back. Suddenly, Jared's imagination spiraled, and he envisioned himself losing his temper, rejecting Batman's words and preparing an ice spell. He unleashed a massive ice storm on Caper, followed by several more powerful attacks. After launching a barrage of magic, he conjured a fireball and hurled it at his enemy, engulfing the area in a cloud of smoke. As the smoke began to clear, Kier emerged completely unharmed, drawing his sword. The swift and precise movement, Caper sliced Jared in half before he had a chance to retaliate, but it was all in Jared's mind, a fleeting fantasy of how things could go terribly wrong. Realizing this, Jared calmed himself, recognizing that Caper was a B-rank tank, not someone he could afford to fight recklessly. Caper, the leader of a central territory twice the size of Kriba, was someone Jared would have to deal with carefully. As Jared considered this, Kair politely asked if he agreed with peace. No, it would be futile to start a fight with Caper now. Jared nodded in agreement, much to Caper's delight, who commended Jared for having a good heart. Jared, however, had other plans. He thought to himself that eventually he would find a way to eliminate Caper, but now is not the time. That night at the mansion Ella had been given, Lena was resting in her bed outside. Ella, with her red hair flowing, was sipping wine, enjoying the in his war. Kay retorted, stating that Kia was on the brink of being overtaken by enemies, which should have been reason enough for Jared to ask for Ella's assistance. Ella took another sip of wine and mused that, judging by the results, it seemed like Jared had been preparing for this war for quite some time. CL agreed, saying she felt the same when she first met him, but Jared was always thinking ahead. Revealed that she had several chances to speak with him during their downtime, and Jared would always ask if she was well. He even knew that most great elves preferred to stay within the safety of their own territory, and asked her why she was traveling the world. In truth, Jared was aware of the cruel fake CLO's father had met the hands of the Black Orcs. Ella, surprised by this, noted that the great elves were the only ones who knew that information, and she only knew because Chloe had confided in her. CLO continued, explaining that Jared had also advised her not to seek vengeance on the Black Orcs, but to look ahead to something far greater in the distant future. Ellis, smiling, remarked that such words were typical of Jared and wondered aloud how the boy knew so much. Kay confessed that she too was curious to understand how Jared knew all these things. Ella then stood up, suggesting that CLO should keep an eye on Jared as they still had plenty of time left in Kriba before leaving. Ella playfully added that Chloe should let her know if she started feeling anything else as well. Chloe, realizing what Ella was about to do, saw her master grabbing a bottle of wine, clearly intending to offer it to Jared. Embarrassed CLO thought to herself that this was exactly why there were so many rumors about her master. Meanwhile, in a dark alley in Mura that same night, a man threw a glass bottle against the wall, cursing Horos for being an idiot. The man with white and black hair was furious that the former lord of Mura had not only led so many soldiers to their deaths but had also lost the war, and died himself as he packed up the chemical compounds he was trafficking. The man grumbled about the money he had lost because of that fool. After securing the goods, he ordered his vassals to take all the money and anything valuable before following him out of Mura. During his departure from the hideout, the young man also thinks that his trade routes are safe, so they just needed to prepare for the future once they got out of there. However, one of his subordinates warns him that he should look to the left, and the man sighs, while saying that person was fast upon looking to the side. The young man sees that Jared was accompanied by his army, and the blonde youth says hello to Puo with a menacing expression. He asks where Puo was going in such a hurry that the young man says he was moving because of his new job. He begins to activate an amulet shaped like a clock and then says he didn't have time for our protagonist. The boy quickly retorts that he was also busy capturing him and his subordinates, and then he launches several magic missiles at his opponent. For some reason, Pu remains calm, simply watching the magic coming toward him. The young man thinks it's a nuisance and immediately activates his magic artifact, but that the spatial distortion clock makes all of Jared's spells stop. Enlilakaz asks if PR was also a mage, but Jared responds that he is not. The blonde explains that it's an effect of his artifact which can delay spells within a 20 m radius of PRA. Our protagonist thinks that the artifact can affect tier 5 magic, but he's still a tier 4, therefore whether he likes it or not to make an effective attack, he would have to be at least 20 m away from his enemy. Immediately after the boy enters the artifact's barrier, PR is surprised by the attitude of the Lord of Kia and questions if a mage was willing to fight him so close. Jared ignores his opponent and says that since PR was the ruler of the infamous Detrahair drug cell, the man would meet his end that night. Seeing that he might be eliminated, the man assumes his enemy must be tired since he was there right after the war had ended. Then trying to bargain, he asked the blonde to forget about it and suggests they make a deal. Smiling, the young man states that he will pay double the amount he gave Koros, and perhaps even 3 times more, and suggests that Jared turn a blind eye to him. PR also says that he didn't want to start a war with the new lord of the territory his organization occupied. Lax gets irritated by that attitude, and Jared thinks that if he lets PR go this time, the northern region of the NAS continent will fall under Dare's influence. In the future, Len would be known as the Living Fortress and PR would be known as the Red Hand of the Tyrant, the Demon King's advisor. Finally, the blonde declares that it's all right and that they would have to eliminate people like PR and maintain MCA's dignity as a new territory. Feeling offended, the young man draws his sword and says it would be impossible to negotiate. Then he asks if defeating Akun had gone to our protagonist head. Jared immediately lowers his sleeve and reveals a golden artifact on his wrist. The young man thinks that according to the 5th option of that artifact, if his level is lower than his opponent's, his strength and intelligence will be doubled. PR simply watches a purple aura emanating from Jared and is frightened by it. Then, being overcome by darkness, the Lord asks if his opponent was ready to take a nap. A battle begins in the middle of the city of Mura between the warriors of Kriba and the criminals. Our protagonist is in a frantic fight against his opponent PRA. The man begins to envelop his sword with an ability called Recklessness and immediately slices through all of Jared's spells. Then the young man leaves toward the Flying Lord. One of Kia's warriors stands in front of PRA and says he won't let the young man harm his lord, but the blonde asks his soldier to stand back. The young man with black and white hair with a simple strike manages to split the warrior's shield in half, who is terrified by this. Immediately after, he jumps on the soldier's head and leaves toward Jared. The boy simply watches his enemy coming toward him and immediately uses his light magic with that bright flash. Pra is momentarily blinded when he regains his sight. The young man only sees several magic missiles coming his way. The subordinates become worried about their master seeing that the young man was hit. However, the man manages to return to the ground safely, only slightly hurt. While noting that Jared was very strong, the young man also thinks that Puo would be extremely weaker. Pu becomes completely infuriated and says that the former Lord Horos was the same, and like him the boys seem to have a very loose tongue. The blonde doesn't let himself be affected and says he was just telling the truth, and that the spatial distortion clock also seemed like nothing but a toy. Unable to listen any longer, Jared's enemy evolves his ability to stage 2 and becomes significantly stronger. Furious, he charges toward the Lord, who starts to fly backward. Distancing himself, the young man uses his flight magic to flee from his enemy and immediately activates his fire attack. After sending a fireball, Pra manages to cut through the magic with just one strike and continues pursuing Jared. The boy turns into an alley to try to shake off his opponent, but the swordsman is too fast and catches up. He then uses his magic to break 2 walls surrounding him and the debris begins to fall toward Pra. However, the young man, in rage, uses those concrete shards to jump on them and advance further toward Jared. Pra charges at his enemy, ready to slice him. At that moment, the boy turns around and notices his opponent approaching. When Pr attempts to strike Jared, he only cuts part of his opponent's coat. Seeing that his enemy dodged the attack at the last moment, the bandit asks if it was teleportation. Jared continues mocking him, saying he was scared since with just one blow he could have been sliced in 2, but now was his turn. And the young man begins to summon dark magic into his hands. Then he uses his lightning magic along with his dark pow, sending it toward the criminal. After being struck, the young man writhes in pain on the ground. Jared asks his opponent to give up, since if he were a swordsman, Pra would be a tricky opponent to deal with, given that the man was faster than any other ordinary swordsman and each of his sword strikes was absurdly strong. However, unlike a normal swordsman, Jared had no intention of stepping into his opponent's attack range. As he gets up, the white-haired man says Jared's analysis was frightening and that it could even be applauded. Suddenly, he uses his recklessness ability again, advancing to stage 3 and becoming extremely muscular. Smiling like a maniac, he says that since Jared is such a clever boy, he should figure out who's going to win this fight. However, with confidence, the young man declares he is already 100% certain that the victory is his. Unable to bear the insults any longer, Pra uses his recklessness once more, advancing to the 4th stage, thinking he will finish Jared off with just one strike with his muscular legs. He charges at his opponent, causing you in the ground to crack. Jared, seeing such speed, becomes extremely worried and scared. Then with his blade, the Lord of Kia's enemy attacks and pierces someone. However, it is revealed that the one who had been pierced by the sword was Pra. Jared, who had seemed frightened, changes his expression and says he didn't think the man would be fooled so easily. The chapter begins with the narrator explaining that despite Delk and Pr being strong enemies, the two are completely different. Delk, weakened over time, was partially sealed by magic and had a frail body. Puo, on the other hand, was in the midst of his evolution with access to all his abilities, territorial advantages, and artifacts. Even though Jared could easily dodge Delk's attack patterns and slowly drain his life by wisely using his magic, either of them could kill him with a single blow if he let his guard down for just 1 second. However, that type of strategy wasn't Pr or Caper style. Faced with this dilemma, Jared bet on Pr's special ability, recklessness. This ability works as if you were stepping on an accelerator, thus the user can increase their physical capacity in stages, and it's very effective against the Lord. However, Jared provoked Pr to make him advance through the stages of recklessness. Being a proud man with a notorious criminal reputation, Pra couldn't endure so many insults. Then, after his mind was overtaken by recklessness, Jared used spatial magic to pierce Pua with his own sword. Pr made a mistake he normally wouldn't have at cost in his life. Jared explains to his enemy that to win that battle he should have kept a cool head and a warm heart, as people say. Next, the young man takes a powder in his hand and explains that countless people died because of the drugs Pr sold, people who went into debt because of it, and this would be revenge for them. Thus our protagonist puts the drug into his opponent's mouth. The Lord also says that since the criminal always proudly sold it, he should feel firsthand the sensation of using that drug, and upon ingesting it the criminal begins to writhe and convulse. Finally the young man says he will be decapitated since threatening the nation's future and its citizens is an unforgivable crime. At that moment Jared's soldiers had already subdued the criminals of Mura. Seeing his lord arrive after the victory, Lacus explains that they were already suppressing the remaining rebels. The lord of Kia then states that even the PR turned Mura into the largest drug cartel hub. Some criminal nations were still operating there, and with an extremely menacing expression he declares that before sunrise it would wipe them all out. He orders his soldiers that if any criminals resist they are not to be allowed to live. Furthermore, all criminals should be silenced before anything else, as that land will no longer be governed by crime. So they begin the work, and after a long day of cleansing in Mura, by the early morning the sun finally begins to rise. Tired Laz looks at someone while thinking that his lord always overcame countless difficulties with his mysterious wisdom. But this time, instead of showing everyone that wisdom, he showed his sharp, decisive and swift nature, and the image his lord conveyed was that of an emperor on the rise with a gleam in his eyes. Watching the lord, the young man feels proud, and thus Louis Experience experiences his first awakening. After all these events, a massive pile of paperwork left behind by Horos can be seen covered with all those papers. Jared thinks that the place was a mess, and that he didn't have time to deal with all that paperwork. Looking at it, the boy mentions that there were two things he needed to do. One was to enter the ancestral tombs around MCA to gain more power, and the other was to find a skill expert who could mine CIA. Jared explains that CIA is a particularly difficult ore to extract, discovered 13 years ago in Paradiso, and is stronger than iron. He asserts that if Kia manages to get their hands on, would slowly be reformed immediately. Jared agrees and selects that person. However, Tonio had been executed for being a counselor to Horos, and there was no way to hire him anymore. The second option was Katie, a girl with a sixth sense for business. Jared knows he doesn't have many options, so he promptly chooses to hire her. However, he can, as after requesting extra income from Horos, Katie was exiled. The last candidate was Marklin, who was the type of person who pretends to be kind to others yet was still quite skilled. Reluctantly Jared agreed, as he would have to work with what he had, but he fails again, as after Kur goes a death, Marklin resigned and fled the same night. Seeing that there was no one useful in that city to help him, the boy falls to the ground in despair, wondering what kind of place that was. The young man states that there wasn't a single talented person in Mura, and this was the first time his wisdom and mind had failed him. Depressed, he wonders if he should bring Oren or Ayla there, but immediately dismisses the